The auctioneer's gavel froze mid-air as 17-year-old Hope Meadowbrook collapsed onto the wooden platform, crimson droplets spattering her worn calico dress like fallen petals. Her desperate grip on 6-year-old Little Bear's trembling hand was the only thing keeping her upright. This wasn't supposed to be a death auction. Mrs. Patterson's horrified gasp echoed across the town square as 3 other bidders stepped backward, suddenly realizing they were witnessing a child's final moments. The metallic scent of blood mixed with Wyoming dust, while Little Bear's silent tears carved clean tracks down his dirt-stained cheeks. Hope's mind flashed to their mother's last words. "Promise me you'll keep him safe." Now she was failing, her lungs betraying her when Little Bear needed her most. "Someone call Doc Morrison," Sheriff Daniels barked, though his voice cracked with the knowledge that medical bills had brought them here in the first place. Who would bid on a dying girl and her mute brother? And what kind of monster would separate them in their darkest hour? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 2 weeks before that terrible September morning, Hope Meadowbrook had believed in miracles. She'd sit by Little Bear's bedside in their ramshackle cabin, watching his chest rise and fall with each labored breath, and whisper Cherokee prayers their mother had taught her. "Galv quodiu duyuktov," she'd murmur. "Healing will come." But healing, it seemed, required money they didn't possess. Hope carried the weight of 2 tragedies in her 17-year-old heart. The first had come with the cavalry's dawn raid 2 years prior, when Captain Morrison's soldiers had swept through their peaceful Cherokee settlement like a plague of locusts. Her parents, Thomas and Star Dancing Meadowbrook, had died protecting the children, Hope and the orphaned boy they'd taken in as their own. Little Bear, whose real name was Running Wolf, hadn't spoken a single word since watching his birth parents fall beneath the soldiers' bullets. The second tragedy was slower, crueler. Hope's lungs, weakened by grief and poor nutrition, had begun their betrayal 6 months ago. First came the persistent cough that echoed through their one-room cabin like a death knell. Then the fever that burned through her small frame, leaving her cheeks hollow and her green eyes too large for her face. Finally, the blood, bright crimson droplets that stained her handkerchiefs and shattered any remaining hope for a normal life. Dr. Benjamin Morrison, ironically, the son of the captain who'd destroyed their world, had treated Hope's condition with reluctant professionalism. His medical bills accumulated like autumn leaves, $50 for consultations, $30 for laudanum, $40 for the useless tonics that promised strength but delivered only false hope. When the final invoice reached $200, Hope's world crumbled completely. "You can work off the debt," Dr. Morrison had suggested with clinical detachment, his pale eyes avoiding her gaze. "Though I doubt you'll live long enough to settle it." His words carried the weight of a death sentence, delivered with the same casual indifference he might use to discuss the weather. Little Bear possessed an otherworldly artistic gift that both blessed and cursed their small family. With nothing but charcoal from their dying fire and scraps of bark paper, he created haunting images that seemed to peer into souls and predict futures. His latest drawing showed 2 small figures standing on a platform while dark shapes surrounded them, a prophecy that made Hope's blood run cold. Samuel Ironheart, known to the world as Sam Thunder, had spent 32 years running from his Cherokee heritage. After being discharged from the Army for treating wounded Native Americans against direct orders, he'd adopted the identity of a simple cattle rancher. His remote homestead in Wyoming's hidden valleys served as more than just a ranch. It was a sanctuary for displaced Cherokee families seeking refuge from an increasingly hostile world. But Sam carried secrets deeper than his false name. In his saddlebags lay faded daguerreotypes of a woman whose smile could light up the darkest winter night. Star Dancing, Hope's mother, and the only woman he'd ever truly loved. The debt collection notice arrived on a Tuesday morning when the September air still held summer's dying warmth. Hope had been teaching Little Bear his letters using charcoal on smooth river stones when Sheriff Daniels knocked on their cabin door with the reluctant heaviness of a man forced to deliver bad news to children. "Miss Meadowbrook," he said, removing his hat and clutching it against his chest like a shield. "I'm mighty sorry, but Dr. Morrison's called in your family's debt. $200 plus interest. Payments due by week's end or—" He trailed off, unable to meet her eyes. "Or what, Sheriff?" Hope's voice carried a steel that belied her 17 years and failing health. "Indentured servitude auction. It's the law, child. I got no choice in the matter." The words hit Hope like a physical blow. She'd heard whispers of such auctions, desperate souls sold to the highest bidder to work off debts they could never hope to repay. But those were stories about adults, about men who'd gambled away their fortunes or women who'd borrowed beyond their means. Not children, never children. Little Bear looked up from his makeshift lesson, his dark eyes understanding more than any 6-year-old should. Without speaking, he never spoke anymore. He reached for Hope's trembling hand and squeezed it with surprising strength. That evening, Hope sat by their meager fire and attempted the impossible. She counted their possessions on her fingers. Her mother's silver locket, worth perhaps $5, a Cherokee blanket, hand-woven by her grandmother, maybe $10 to the right buyer, Little Bear's charcoal drawings, worthless to everyone but them. Even if she sold everything they owned, including the clothes on their backs, she'd raise perhaps $20, a drop in the ocean of their debt. The next 3 days became a blur of desperate attempts and crushing rejections. Hope approached every business in Willowbrook with the dignity her mother had instilled in her, offering her services despite the persistent cough that left bloody specks on her handkerchief. At the Silver Dollar Saloon, proprietor Jake Thompson looked her up and down with calculating eyes before shaking his head. "You're too sick, girl. Can't have you coughing blood into the customer's whiskey." His dismissal stung, not because it was cruel, but because it was accurate. The seamstress, Mrs. Catherine Winters, hired Hope for exactly 2 hours before sending her home. "Your hands shake too much from the fever," she explained with genuine sympathy. "I can't afford to have dresses ruined by unsteady stitches." Even Pastor Williams at the First Presbyterian Church, a man who preached weekly about Christian charity, could only offer prayers instead of employment. "The congregation is uncomfortable with native hymns," he admitted with shame coloring his pale cheeks. "I wish I could do more, child, but my hands are tied." By Friday evening, Hope had exhausted every possibility. She sat in their cabin's single chair, Little Bear curled in her lap like a wounded animal seeking comfort, and faced the terrible truth. They would be sold. That night, as storm clouds gathered over the Wyoming hills, Hope held Little Bear close and sang their mother's lullabies in Cherokee. Her voice, once strong enough to fill their cabin with joy, now came out thin and wavering. But Little Bear pressed his ear to her chest, listening to both her heartbeat and her words, as if memorizing them for darker days ahead. "Kvyalialitse higeso," she whispered against his hair. "You are loved beyond measure." Little Bear pulled back and looked at her with those ancient eyes that held too much understanding. Then, for the first time in 2 years, he opened his mouth and spoke a single word. "Sister." The word hung in the air between them like a sacred promise. Hope's tears came then, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of hearing his voice again, even as their world crumbled around them. Saturday morning dawned clear and merciless. Hope dressed Little Bear in his cleanest shirt, a faded blue cotton that had belonged to their father, and braided her own auburn hair with trembling fingers. She pinned her mother's silver locket to her worn brown dress, not for its monetary value, but as a talisman of the love that had shaped her. The walk to Willowbrook's town square felt like a funeral march. Townspeople stopped their morning routines to stare, some with pity, others with the morbid curiosity reserved for public spectacles. Hope kept her chin raised and her shoulders straight, her mother's voice echoing in her memory. A Cherokee woman walks with dignity, no matter what storms may come. As they approached the makeshift auction platform, rough wooden planks hastily assembled in the square's center, Hope squeezed Little Bear's hand 3 times. It was their secret code, developed in the darkest days after their parents' death. 3 squeezes meant, "I love you," and he squeezed back with the same rhythm. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The auction platform stood in Willowbrook's town square like a monument to human cruelty, its rough-hewn planks still bearing the scars from previous sales of livestock and farm equipment. Now it would witness something far more devastating: the commodification of 2 children whose only crime was surviving tragedy. Auctioneer Harold Grimsby, a barrel-chested man with tobacco-stained teeth, tapped his gavel against the wooden podium with the casual indifference of someone who'd sold everything from prize bulls to foreclosed farms. "Ladies and gentlemen," he bellowed to the gathering crowd, "we have before us today the settlement of Dr. Morrison's outstanding medical debt, $200, to be satisfied through the purchase of these individuals." Hope felt the word individuals slice through her like a blade. Not children, not people with names and dreams and fears, just individuals, as impersonal as the cattle sold here every Thursday. Little Bear pressed closer to her side, his small body trembling despite the warm September air. Hope could feel his rapid heartbeat through his thin shirt and wished desperately that she could shield him from what was about to happen. But there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The law had backed them into this corner, and the only way out was through. "The girl is 17, appears to have some domestic skills despite her condition," Grimsby continued, his eyes avoiding Hope's face as if looking at her directly might remind him of her humanity. "The boy is 6, small for his age but appears healthy. They come as a pair. Buyer takes both or neither." A murmur rippled through the crowd of perhaps 50 townspeople. Hope recognized most faces: Mrs. Patterson from the general store, whose eyes glistened with unshed tears; Tom Bradley, the blacksmith, who stared at his boots rather than witness the proceedings; and Pastor Williams, who clutched his Bible like a lifeline while his face burned with shame. But it was the calculating stares that made Hope's skin crawl. Mine foreman Dutch Kessler evaluated them like he might assess a new vein of silver ore, useful until exhausted, then discarded. Madame Rosalie, who ran the brothel on the edge of town, examined Hope with the cold pragmatism of someone who understood exactly what services a desperate young woman might be forced to provide. "Do I hear an opening bid?" Grimsby called out, his voice carrying across the square with practiced ease. "These are healthy workers, good for domestic service, farm labor, or whatever other needs the buyer might have." Silence stretched like a taut rope ready to snap. Hope held her breath, caught between terror that someone would bid and horror that no one would. If they remained unsold, what then? The territorial prison. Separation anyway, as they were distributed to whoever would take responsibility for them. Finally, Dutch Kessler raised his weathered hand. $25 for the boy alone. Got no use for a sick girl." Hope's heart stopped. "No," she whispered. Then louder, "No, you can't separate us. Please, we stay together." Her voice cracked with desperation, but she pressed on. "I can work. I'm stronger than I look." A violent coughing fit seized her then, as if her body conspired to contradict her words. Blood spotted her handkerchief, crimson evidence of her failing health. Little Bear wrapped his thin arms around her waist, offering what comfort he could while his own tears fell silently. $30 for the boy, called out Samuel Hendricks, who owned a struggling farm outside town. Need help with the harvest. Hope's world tilted. They were discussing Little Bear like he was a piece of equipment, a tool to be purchased and used until broken. She looked into his frightened face and saw her own terror reflected back. This couldn't be happening. This was America in 1881, not some medieval marketplace where children were sold to the highest bidder. But Dr. Morrison stepped forward from the crowd's edge, his medical bag clutched in his white-knuckled grip. "The debt must be satisfied," he announced, with professional detachment that didn't quite mask his discomfort. $200, or the equivalent in service value. $40 for both, offered Mrs. Eliza Hartwell, whose husband had died the previous winter, leaving her with a large house and failing finances. "I need help with domestic duties, and the girl can teach the boy proper manners." Hope felt a flicker of hope at the word both, but Mrs. Hartwell's reputation for harsh treatment of her servants was well known. Still, it was better than separation, better than Dutch Kessler's rough hands on Little Bear, better than the alternative uses some bidders might have in mind. The bidding continued with painful slowness, each increment representing months or years of unpaid labor. $50 from the mill owner who needed workers small enough to crawl into tight spaces. $60 from a rancher who saw Little Bear as a future cowherd. $75 from a woman whose previous domestic help had mysteriously disappeared after 6 months. Hope's legs began to shake, whether from illness or terror she couldn't tell. The morning sun beat down on the platform, making her fever worse and turning her worn dress damp with perspiration. She swayed slightly, and Little Bear immediately moved to support her weight, his 6-year-old frame straining against the burden. "Going once at $75 to Mrs. Adelaide Thornton," Grimsby announced, raising his gavel. "Going twice." That's when the stranger appeared. He materialized from the crowd's back edge like an answered prayer, tall and weathered with the kind of quiet strength that made people instinctively step aside. His blue eyes, sharp as winter sky, locked onto Hope's face with an intensity that took her breath away. Something flickered in his expression, recognition, pain, determination, as if he'd seen a ghost. $150. His voice cut through the morning air like a blade through silk, deep and steady and utterly certain. Cash. The crowd fell silent, stunned by the astronomical bid that dwarfed all previous offers combined. Hope stared at this unexpected savior, noting the way he held himself, the careful control in his movements, the familiarity in his eyes that she couldn't quite place. Little Bear stepped slightly forward, some instinct telling him that this man was different from the others. The mysterious bidder's words hung in the air like thunder after lightning, leaving the entire town square in stunned silence. $150, more money than most families in Willowbrook saw in a year, offered without hesitation for 2 children most considered damaged goods. Hope stared at the man who'd spoken, trying to understand what she saw in his weathered features. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with the kind of lean strength that came from years of hard physical work. His dark hair showed threads of premature silver at the temples, and his blue eyes held depths that spoke of both kindness and carefully guarded secrets. Most striking was the way he looked at her, not with the calculating assessment of the other bidders, but with something that resembled recognition, even sorrow. "Sir," auctioneer Grimsby stammered, clearly flustered by the unexpected windfall, "might I ask your name for the record?" "Samuel Ironheart," the man replied, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I run the Thunder Creek Ranch, about 20 miles north. I have the money right here." He withdrew a leather pouch from his coat and poured gold coins onto the auctioneer's table, each piece catching the morning sunlight like captured stars. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Gold was rarely seen in these parts, most transactions handled through credit barter, or the occasional silver dollar. The sight of such wealth in the hands of a stranger raised immediate questions about his identity and intentions. But before Grimsby could bring down his gavel, another voice cut through the murmur of amazed conversation. $200. The crowd parted to reveal Colonel Jeremiah Blackstone, resplendent in his perfectly tailored black suit despite the morning heat. At 50, Blackstone carried himself with the rigid posture of his military past, his steel-gray hair perfectly groomed and his pale eyes as cold as winter ice. He was Willowbrook's wealthiest resident, owner of 3 silver mines and influential enough to have territorial politicians in his pocket. Hope's blood turned to ice water in her veins. She'd heard whispers about Colonel Blackstone, stories shared in hushed tones around kitchen fires and laundry lines. He had a particular interest in children, they said, especially those of mixed heritage. Some families had gladly sent their young ones to his educational facility outside town, desperate for the good wages he offered. But those children were never seen again in Willowbrook, and letters from them became increasingly rare before stopping altogether. Samuel Ironheart's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as he studied his new competition. Something passed between the two men, a recognition that suggested their paths had crossed before and not pleasantly. $250, Samuel countered without hesitation, adding more coins to his pile. $300, Blackstone replied smoothly, his smile never wavering. I have great plans for these children's education. The way he said education made Hope's skin crawl. She instinctively pulled Little Bear closer and felt him trembling against her side. Whatever Colonel Blackstone intended for them, it wouldn't be salvation. $400. Samuel's voice carried a note of steel that hadn't been there before. Several women in the crowd gasped at the astronomical sum. Colonel Blackstone's smile faltered slightly, but he rallied quickly. $500. The announcement sent shockwaves through the gathered townspeople. $500 was more than most of them would see in 5 years of hard labor. Samuel Ironheart closed his eyes for a moment, and Hope saw his lips move silently, as if offering a prayer or making some internal calculation that went beyond mere money. When he opened them again, his gaze found hers across the crowd, and she saw something in those blue depths that made her heart skip, a fierce protectiveness that reminded her painfully of her father's expression when danger threatened their family. $1,000, Samuel announced quietly, his words carrying clearly across the now silent square. Cash. Right now. The sound that rose from the crowd was somewhere between a gasp and a moan. $1,000. Enough to buy a small ranch, complete with livestock and equipment, enough to live comfortably for a decade or more. The sheer audacity of the bid left everyone speechless, including Colonel Blackstone, whose carefully controlled composure finally cracked. "Sir," Blackstone said through gritted teeth, "I believe you're being rather excessive for 2 half-breed children." The racial slur hung in the air like a poison cloud, and Hope flinched as if she'd been struck. But Samuel Ironheart's reaction was far more dramatic. He stepped forward, and suddenly the crowd could see what Hope had sensed from the beginning. This was not a man to be crossed lightly. "Those children have names," Samuel said quietly, his voice carrying a dangerous undertone that made several people step backward. "Their names are Hope and Little Bear, and they deserve better than to be discussed like livestock by men who wouldn't recognize human decency if it bit them on the—" "Gentlemen," Auctioneer Grimsby interrupted hastily, sweat beading on his forehead despite the morning chill. "Let's maintain some dignity here. Do I hear any bid higher than $1,000? Colonel Blackstone's face had gone white with rage, but even his considerable wealth had limits. $1,000 would require liquidating significant assets, and his pride warred with his obsession. After a long moment, he stepped back with a cold smile. "Enjoy your purchase, Mr. Ironheart," he said, somehow making the word purchase sound obscene. "I'm sure we'll be seeing each other again soon." The threat was barely veiled, but Samuel ignored it. "Going once?" Grimsby called nervously. "Going twice?" His gavel came down with finality. "Sold to Samuel Ironheart for $1,000. Hope felt her knees buckle with relief, and only Little Bear's surprising strength kept her upright. They were saved. But by whom and at what cost? $1,000 created a debt she could never hope to repay in several lifetimes of service. Samuel approached the platform with long, measured strides, his eyes never leaving Hope's face. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes, the small scar on his left temple, the way his hands moved with the careful precision of someone accustomed to handling both delicate instruments and dangerous situations. "Miss Hope," he said formally, offering his hand to help her down from the platform. "Little Bear." His pronunciation of their names carried a subtle accent she couldn't quite place, something that suggested familiarity with Cherokee inflections. "Mr. Ironheart," Hope managed, her voice barely above a whisper. We thank you. But I must ask why you would spend such a fortune on strangers." Samuel's expression softened slightly. "You're not strangers, child. Not to me." But before she could ask what he meant, he turned to address the dispersing crowd. "We'll be leaving immediately. I have a wagon waiting." The next few minutes passed in a blur of activity. Dr. Morrison grudgingly accepted Samuel's payment, counting each gold coin with the mechanical precision of a man who'd rather not think too deeply about the transaction. Sheriff Daniels shook Samuel's hand and muttered something about Christian charity, though his eyes suggested he wondered what kind of Christian carried $1,000 in gold. But it was Mrs. Patterson who approached Hope directly, her weathered face creased with concern. "Child," she whispered, pressing a small bundle into Hope's hands, "I packed some supplies. Jerky, hardtack, a jar of honey. That cough of yours needs tending." Hope's eyes filled with tears at this simple kindness from a woman who had no obligation to help. "Thank you," she managed. "I won't forget your kindness." "See that you don't," Mrs. Patterson replied gruffly, but her voice caught slightly. "And you write if you need anything, you hear?" Some of us in this town still remember what decency looks like. Samuel's wagon proved to be a sturdy affair, well-maintained and pulled by two strong horses that spoke of their owner's prosperity. He helped Hope and Little Bear onto the bench seat with surprising gentleness, his calloused hands careful not to grip too tightly or linger too long. As they prepared to leave Willowbrook behind, Hope caught sight of Colonel Blackstone standing in the shadow of the bank building, his pale eyes fixed on their wagon with an intensity that made her shiver. Even at this distance, she could feel his malevolence like a cold wind, and she knew instinctively that their encounter with him was far from over. "Mr. Ironheart," she said quietly as Samuel climbed onto the driver's seat, "that man, Colonel Blackstone, he's not going to simply let this go, is he?" Samuel followed her gaze, and his jaw tightened. "No," he said simply. "Men like Blackstone don't accept defeat gracefully. But don't worry yourself about him right now. We have a long ride ahead, and there are things we need to discuss." As the wagon rolled away from the town square, Hope found herself studying her mysterious benefactor's profile. There was something familiar about the line of his jaw, the way he held his shoulders, even the careful way he handled the reins. But more than that, there was something in his manner toward them that went beyond mere charity or even sympathy. Little Bear, who had remained silent through the entire auction ordeal, suddenly reached out and touched Samuel's arm. When the man looked down, Little Bear pointed to himself and then to Samuel, a question in his dark eyes. Samuel's composure cracked slightly, and Hope saw pain flicker across his features. "Yes, little warrior," he said softly, using what Hope recognized as a Cherokee term of endearment. "I know who you are. I know who you both are." The admission hung in the air between them as the wagon wheels rolled steadily northward, carrying them away from their old life and toward an uncertain future. Hope clutched Little Bear's hand and tried to quiet the questions multiplying in her mind. Who was Samuel Ironheart really? How did he know them? And what had he meant when he said they weren't strangers? Behind them, the dust of their passage settled back onto the road, but Hope could still feel Colonel Blackstone's cold eyes following them like a curse. Whatever sanctuary Samuel Ironheart offered, she suspected it would be temporary at best. Men like Blackstone didn't simply disappear, and debts, financial or otherwise, had a way of coming due when least expected. But for now, for this moment, they were free and together and alive. It was more than she'd dared hope for when she'd awakened that morning, and she would hold on to that small miracle as tightly as she held Little Bear's trusting hand. The journey to Thunder Creek Ranch unfolded like pages from a dream. Hope wasn't sure she wanted to wake from. Samuel Ironheart drove with the quiet competence of a man who knew these mountain trails intimately, guiding his team through winding paths that seemed to lead deeper into Wyoming's untamed wilderness with each passing mile. For the first hour, they traveled in relative silence, broken only by the rhythmic clip-clop of hooves and the gentle creaking of wagon wheels. Hope found herself stealing glances at her mysterious benefactor, trying to reconcile his obvious prosperity with his willingness to spend a fortune on two Cherokee outcasts. His hands on the reins were steady and sure, marked by old scars that spoke of both hard work and perhaps harder battles. Little Bear had fallen asleep against Hope's shoulder, exhausted by the morning's trauma. In sleep, he looked even younger than his 6 years, his face peaceful in a way it rarely was during waking hours. Hope smoothed his dark hair and felt the familiar tightness in her chest that had nothing to do with her illness and everything to do with the weight of responsibility she carried for this precious child. "He's been through hell," Samuel observed quietly, his eyes on the trail ahead, but his attention clearly on them. "You both have." Hope stiffened slightly. "How would you know what we've been through, Mr. Ironheart?" Samuel was quiet for so long that Hope began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of old pain. "Because I knew your parents, both sets of them." The words hit Hope like a physical blow. She turned to stare at Samuel's profile, searching for any sign of deception and finding none. "That's impossible. My parents died 2 years ago in the cavalry raid. Little Bear's parents died the same day." "You're too young to have known them well enough to—" "I was there," Samuel interrupted, his voice so quiet she had to strain to hear him. "I was with Captain Morrison's unit, serving as a field medic. I tried to save them. Hope, I tried to save them all." The revelation struck Hope speechless. This man, this stranger who had just spent $1,000 to purchase their freedom, had been present at the worst day of her life, had witnessed her parents' death, had perhaps even held them as they died. "You were a soldier," she whispered, understanding flooding through her like ice water. "You were one of Morrison's men." "I was," Samuel admitted, his knuckles white on the reins. "And I've regretted every moment of that day for 2 long years. Your mother, star dancing. She recognized me at the end. She made me promise to look after you if anything ever happened to her." Hope's world tilted on its axis. Her mother had spoken to this man in her final moments, had trusted him enough to extract a promise about her children's welfare. The idea was both comforting and deeply disturbing. "Why should I believe you?" Hope demanded, though even as she spoke, part of her recognized the truth in his words. Why should I trust a soldier who participated in the slaughter of my people? Samuel brought the wagon to a halt beside a small stream where the horses could drink and rest. He turned to face her fully, and Hope saw raw anguish in his blue eyes. Because I didn't participate, he said firmly. I was ordered to provide medical support, not to fight. When I saw what was happening, the killing of women and children, the burning of homes, I tried to stop it. I was court-martialed and discharged for disobeying orders and treating Cherokee wounded against direct commands. Hope studied his face, looking for any sign of deception. What she saw instead was a man carrying tremendous guilt, someone who had clearly been haunted by that terrible day as much as she had been. My discharge papers are back at the ranch, Samuel continued. You can read them if you want proof. They cite me for conduct unbecoming an officer and providing aid and comfort to hostile Indians. Captain Morrison wanted me hanged for treason. Little Bear stirred in Hope's arms, opening his dark eyes and looking around with the confused alertness of a child waking in an unfamiliar place. When his gaze fell on Samuel, something remarkable happened. Instead of the fear or wariness he showed most adults, Little Bear smiled slightly and reached out one small hand. Samuel's breath caught. "Hello, little warrior," he said softly, using the same Cherokee endearment he'd used earlier. "Did you rest well?" To Hope's amazement, Little Bear nodded and made a small sound, not quite a word but more vocalization than he'd made in months. The child seemed drawn to Samuel in a way that defied logic, as if some part of him recognized a kindred spirit. "He doesn't usually warm up to strangers," Hope said wonderingly. "I'm not a stranger," Samuel replied simply. "I held him the night his birth parents died. He was barely 4 then, crying for his mama in Cherokee while the world burned around us. I carried him to safety, along with you and 6 other children." The memory hit Hope like a physical blow. She had vague recollections of that horrible night. Smoke and screaming, the smell of burning wood and worse things, strong arms carrying her away from everything she'd ever known. But trauma had fragmented those memories, leaving them in disconnected pieces that never quite formed a coherent whole. "The man with gentle hands," she whispered, the words coming from some buried part of her mind. "I remember. Someone who sang Cherokee lullabies while we hid in the cave." Samuel's eyes filled with unshed tears. "Your mother taught me those songs when I was recovering from a wound at their village the winter before. She said music was the only universal language, that it could comfort anyone who was hurting." Hope felt the foundations of her world shifting beneath her feet. This man wasn't a random Good Samaritan or even a guilty ex-soldier seeking redemption. He was intimately connected to the worst and most formative day of her life, carrying secrets and promises that stretched back to her parents' final moments. "What did my mother say to you?" Hope asked, her voice barely audible. "In those last moments, what were her exact words?" Samuel closed his eyes, as if the memory was too painful to face directly. She said, "Promise me you'll find my daughter when she needs you most. Promise me you'll keep her safe when I can't." "I gave her my word, Hope." A dying woman's last request is sacred, to Cherokee and white man alike. Little Bear had been listening with the intense focus that characterized him, his young mind processing conversations that adults often assumed went over his head. Suddenly, he reached out and touched Samuel's scarred hand, then pointed to his own chest and made a soft sound. "He's asking if you made the same promise about him," Hope translated, understanding her little brother's gesture language perfectly. Samuel looked directly at Little Bear with complete seriousness. "Yes, little warrior. Your birth father, Tall Pine, also asked me to watch over you. He said you had the gift of sight, that you would grow up to be a bridge between worlds. I promised him too. Hope's heart constricted with a mixture of grief and wonder. Her parents and Little Bear's parents had died believing this man would somehow find them and fulfill his promises. After 2 years of struggle and desperation, he had appeared at their darkest hour like an answered prayer. "The ranch," Hope said suddenly. "Thunder Creek Ranch. You named it for your Cherokee name, didn't you?" Samuel nodded slowly. "Thunder Horse was the name your mother gave me when she adopted me into the tribe during my recovery. Samuel Ironheart is who I became after the discharge, a man trying to honor Cherokee values while living in the white world." As they resumed their journey, Hope found herself looking at Samuel, Thunder Horse, with new eyes. This man had risked his military career to save Cherokee lives, had been cast out from his own people for showing mercy to hers, and had spent 2 years searching for ways to fulfill deathbed promises to people who had shown him kindness. "Why now?" she asked as the ranch buildings came into view in the distance. "You could have found us months ago, years ago. Why wait until we were on an auction block?" Samuel's jaw tightened. "Because I've been running from Colonel Blackstone for 2 years. He was Captain Morrison's superior officer, and he's never forgiven me for my betrayal of white solidarity. I knew that if I approached you directly, he'd find a way to use it against all of us. I was waiting for you to turn 18, when you'd be legally independent and able to make your own choices." "But the auction changed everything," Hope realized. "The auction forced my hand," Samuel agreed grimly. "I couldn't let Blackstone get his hands on you. I've seen what happens to the children he adopts for his educational experiments. They disappear, Hope, permanently." As Thunder Creek Ranch spread before them, a sprawling complex of well-maintained buildings nestled in a green valley between protective ridges, Hope felt a mixture of hope and apprehension. They were safe for now, but Samuel's words about Colonel Blackstone suggested that safety might be temporary. Little Bear sat up straighter as they approached the ranch, his eyes wide with wonder at the sight of horses grazing in lush pastures and the sound of a clear stream running along the property's edge. For the first time since their parents' death, they were approaching something that might actually become a home. But Hope couldn't shake the feeling that Colonel Blackstone's cold eyes were still watching them, even from 20 miles away, waiting for his opportunity to reclaim what he believed should have been his. 3 weeks at Thunder Creek Ranch had transformed Hope and Little Bear in ways that seemed almost miraculous. The constant fear that had haunted their days in Willowbrook began to fade, replaced by something Hope had almost forgotten existed: the possibility of genuine happiness. Samuel's ranch was a testament to Cherokee values wrapped in the practical necessities of frontier life. The main house, built from local stone and timber, featured traditional Cherokee symbols carved discreetly into the door frames and windowsills. Inside, the rooms were spacious and comfortable, filled with handmade furniture that spoke of both craftsmanship and care. Most importantly, it felt like a home rather than a house, warm, welcoming, and alive with the sounds of daily life. Hope's health had improved dramatically with regular meals and the clean mountain air. The persistent cough that had plagued her for months had diminished to an occasional irritation, and the blood that had spotted her handkerchiefs had disappeared entirely. Samuel attributed this improvement to proper nutrition and rest, but Hope suspected there was something more at work. Something about being in a place where she was valued rather than merely tolerated. Little Bear's transformation was even more remarkable. The silent, frightened child who had clung to Hope's skirts during the auction had begun to bloom under Samuel's patient attention. He spent his days learning to ride the gentle mare Samuel had chosen for him, practicing his letters with charcoal on smooth stones, and creating increasingly elaborate drawings that covered every available surface in his room. Most significantly, Little Bear had begun to speak again. The words came slowly at first. "Thank you" when Samuel helped him mount his horse, "Good morning" when he came down to breakfast, "Sister" when he needed Hope's attention. But gradually his vocabulary expanded, and with it came glimpses of the intelligent, curious child he had been before tragedy stole his voice. Samuel proved to be an ideal guardian in ways that surprised Hope daily. He treated them not as purchased property or charity cases, but as family members whose opinions mattered and whose happiness was important to him. He consulted Hope about meals and household arrangements, included Little Bear in ranch decisions appropriate for a child, and never once reminded them of the debt they could never hope to repay. But it was the small gestures that touched Hope's heart most deeply. Samuel had carved a set of drawing pencils from soft wood for Little Bear's artwork. He'd taught Hope to identify edible plants and herbs in the Cherokee tradition, sharing knowledge that connected her to her heritage. Most precious of all, he'd given them Cherokee names in a private ceremony by the creek. Aita for Hope, meaning first to dance, and Sequoia for Little Bear, after the great Cherokee scholar. Hope found herself falling in love with more than just the safety and security Samuel provided. She was drawn to his quiet strength, his gentle humor, and the way he listened to her thoughts as if they mattered. When he smiled, really smiled, not the polite expressions he wore for strangers, his entire face transformed, revealing the kind, passionate man beneath the cautious exterior. But their growing happiness was shadowed by an undercurrent of tension that Hope couldn't quite identify. Samuel often stood at the window in the evenings, scanning the horizon with the alertness of a man expecting trouble. He taught both children to recognize the sound of approaching riders and had shown them hiding places around the ranch just in case, though he never specified what they might need to hide from. The truth came crashing down on a crisp October morning when Sheriff Daniels arrived at Thunder Creek Ranch, accompanied by two men Hope had never seen before. From her bedroom window, she watched Samuel's posture stiffen as he recognized the visitors, and something cold settled in her stomach. "Miss Hope, Little Bear," Samuel called from downstairs, his voice carefully controlled. "Could you come down, please? We have visitors." Hope found Samuel standing in the main room with three men whose presence filled the space with uncomfortable tension. Sheriff Daniels looked deeply unhappy, his weathered face creased with lines of distress. The other two men wore expensive suits and carried themselves with the arrogance of people accustomed to having their orders followed without question. "Hope, Little Bear," Samuel said carefully, "these gentlemen have some questions about your legal status." The taller of the two strangers stepped forward, consulting a leather folder filled with official-looking documents. "Miss Meadowbrook, I'm Attorney Martin Crane, representing Colonel Jeremiah Blackstone's interests. We have reason to believe that your current guardian obtained custody of you and the boy through fraudulent means." Hope's blood turned to ice. "What do you mean, fraudulent?" Crane smiled with the cold satisfaction of a predator closing in on wounded prey. Mr. Ironheart represented himself as a legitimate rancher with legal standing to purchase indentured servants. However, our investigation has revealed that he is, in fact, a discharged military deserter living under an assumed identity. "That's a lie," Hope said fiercely, stepping closer to Samuel. "He was discharged for treating wounded Cherokee." "That's not desertion. The military records indicate otherwise." The second man spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the flat authority of a government bureaucrat. "I'm Federal Marshal Thompson, and I have a warrant for the arrest of the individual calling himself Samuel Ironheart on charges of desertion, fraud, and harboring fugitive Indians." Hope felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Everything they'd built, all the happiness they'd found, was crumbling before her eyes, but it was the look of resigned defeat on Samuel's face that truly terrified her. "The children had nothing to do with any of this," Samuel said quietly. They're innocent. Which is why Colonel Blackstone, in his Christian generosity, has offered to take responsibility for their proper upbringing and education, Crane replied smoothly. He's prepared to honor the full purchase price Mr. Ironheart paid, ensuring that Dr. Morrison's debt is properly satisfied. Little Bear had been silent during this exchange, but now he stepped forward and took Samuel's hand with the fierce loyalty that had characterized him since their parents' death. "No," he said clearly, his young voice carrying surprising strength. "We stay with Thunder Horse." The use of Samuel's Cherokee name caused both strangers to exchange meaningful glances. "You see," Crane said to Sheriff Daniels, "the children are being indoctrinated into savage ways. Colonel Blackstone's educational methods will correct such influences." Hope's mind raced, searching for any argument that might save them. "Sheriff Daniels, you know what kind of man Colonel Blackstone is? You've heard the stories about the children who go to his facility and are never seen again." Sheriff Daniels looked deeply uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "Hope, child, I don't have a choice here. These men have legal papers, federal warrants." "My hands are tied." "Your hands are tied by Blackstone's money," Samuel said quietly, his voice carrying a note of sadness rather than anger. "How much did he pay you to look the other way, Frank?" The sheriff's face flushed red, but he didn't deny the accusation. Marshal Thompson stepped forward impatiently. "Enough discussion. Samuel Ironheart, also known as Thunder Horse, you're under arrest. The children will be remanded to Colonel Blackstone's custody immediately." As the marshal reached for the handcuffs at his belt, Hope realized that their brief taste of happiness had been nothing more than a cruel illusion. The world was determined to tear their family apart, no matter how hard they fought to stay together. But Little Bear's next action surprised everyone in the room. The 6-year-old boy looked directly at Marshal Thompson and spoke with the clear authority of someone far beyond his years. "You take Thunder Horse. You take part of our souls." Cherokee law says soul thieves must answer to the spirits. The words, delivered in perfect English but carrying the weight of ancient Cherokee tradition, sent a visible shiver through both Crane and Thompson. Even in 1881, men who worked the frontier territories understood that some curses carried power beyond rational explanation. Hope realized that their fight was far from over, and that Little Bear's mysterious gifts might be their only hope of surviving what was coming next. The Blackstone Educational Facility sat like a festering wound on the Wyoming landscape, its imposing stone walls and barred windows more reminiscent of a prison than a school. Hope pressed her face against the carriage window as they approached, her heart sinking with each turn of the wheels that carried them further from freedom and deeper into a nightmare she was only beginning to understand. Colonel Blackstone had maintained his facade of benevolent benefactor during the journey from Thunder Creek Ranch, speaking in measured tones about proper education and civilizing influences. But Hope caught glimpses of something darker beneath his polished exterior, the way his pale eyes lingered too long on Little Bear's drawings, the slight smile that curved his lips when he thought no one was watching, the careful way he phrased his questions about their Cherokee heritage. Little Bear had remained silent since leaving the ranch, retreating into the protective shell of muteness that had served him during their darkest times. But his eyes never stopped moving, cataloging details with the intense focus Hope had learned to recognize as his artistic mind recording everything for later processing. His small hands clutched a piece of charcoal and a scrap of paper Samuel had pressed into his palm during those final heartbreaking moments before the arrest. "Magnificent, isn't it?" Colonel Blackstone said as they passed through iron gates topped with decorative spearheads that looked more functional than ornamental. "I've spared no expense in creating a proper environment for molding young minds. You'll find the discipline here quite thorough." The word discipline sent ice through Hope's veins. She'd heard enough stories about Blackstone's methods to understand that his version of education bore little resemblance to normal teaching. The children who came here were broken down systematically, their cultural identity stripped away piece by piece until nothing remained but hollow obedience. The facility's interior confirmed Hope's worst fears. Long corridors lined with identical doors stretched in both directions, each marked only with a number. The walls were bare stone, scrubbed clean of any decoration or warmth. Even the air felt heavy with suppressed despair, as if the building itself absorbed and held the suffering of everyone who passed through its halls. "Hope will be in Ward C," Blackstone announced to the severe-looking woman who greeted them in the main hall. "Room 47. The boy goes to Ward D, room 23. They're to have no contact with each other during the adjustment period." "No!" Hope's cry echoed off the stone walls. "You can't separate us. We stay together." Blackstone's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the cold satisfaction beneath. "My dear child, attachment to family is one of the primitive instincts we must overcome. You'll find that individual development progresses much more rapidly when emotional dependencies are severed." Two attendants stepped forward, large, impassive men who clearly served as both caregivers and guards. One reached for Little Bear, who immediately pressed against Hope's side with a whimper of terror that cut through her heart like a blade. "Please," Hope begged, wrapping her arms around Little Bear protectively. "He's just a baby. He needs his family." "Family is a savage concept," Blackstone replied with clinical detachment. "We'll replace those unhealthy bonds with proper loyalty to civilized authority. Take them to their rooms." The next few minutes became a blur of struggle and desperate cries. Little Bear fought with surprising strength for such a small child, his silence finally breaking as he screamed Hope's Cherokee name over and over. The sound of his terror followed her down the corridor as she was dragged in the opposite direction, each cry tearing another piece from her already wounded heart. Room 47 was a cell in everything but name. Stone walls, a narrow cot, a single barred window set too high to see out of properly, and a wooden bucket that served purposes she didn't want to contemplate. The door locked from the outside with a heavy iron key, the sound of its turning as final as a coffin lid closing. Hope sank onto the thin mattress and tried to process what had just happened. In the space of a few hours, she'd lost everything: Samuel's protective presence, the warm safety of Thunder Creek Ranch, and most devastating of all, her connection to Little Bear. The child who had been her constant companion and responsibility for 2 years was now alone somewhere in this terrible place, probably crying for her in the darkness. Sleep, when it finally came, brought no relief. Hope's dreams were filled with images of Little Bear calling her name, while faceless figures dragged him deeper into shadow. She woke repeatedly throughout the night, disoriented and reaching for the small, warm body that had shared her bed since their parents' death. Dawn brought no improvement. A bell clanged somewhere in the building's depths, followed by the sound of many doors opening and footsteps in the corridors. Hope's door remained locked, but a slot opened near the floor and someone pushed through a tin bowl containing watery gruel and a crust of stale bread. "Breakfast," a gruff voice announced. "Eat quickly. Orientation begins in 1 hour." Hope had no appetite but forced herself to consume the meager meal. She would need strength for whatever was coming, and she couldn't help Little Bear if she made herself sick with worry and starvation. The orientation proved to be everything she'd feared, and worse. A dozen children of various ages sat in rigid silence in a sparse classroom, their eyes holding the hollow quality Hope had seen in pictures of war survivors. At the front of the room stood a thin, sharp-faced woman who introduced herself as Miss Hartwell, the facility's chief educational supervisor. "Rule 1. Miss Hartwell announced in a voice like grinding stone. No communication in any language except English. Rule 2. No references to your previous life, family, or cultural background. Rule 3. Absolute obedience to all authority figures. Violations result in corrective measures. Hope raised her hand tentatively. Ma'am, what about my brother, Little Bear? I need to know that he's... The blow came without warning, Miss Hartwell's wooden pointer striking Hope's knuckles with shocking force. Pain shot up her arm as she gasped in surprise. Rule 4, Miss Hartwell continued as if nothing had happened. Questions are permitted only when invited. Rule 5. Emotional attachments to other students are forbidden and will be discouraged through appropriate discipline. The morning continued with lessons that had nothing to do with education and everything to do with breaking spirits. Children were required to recite phrases denouncing their heritage, to repeat that their families had been savage and uncivilized, to express gratitude for Colonel Blackstone's efforts to save them from their primitive backgrounds. Hope watched in horror as a boy, perhaps 10 years old, struggled to pronounce words that condemned his own parents as heathens. When he stumbled over the syllables, Miss Hartwell's pointer found his shoulders and back with mechanical precision. But it was during the afternoon session that Hope understood the true depths of Blackstone's twisted vision. The colonel himself appeared in the classroom, his perfectly groomed appearance and benevolent smile making him seem like a kindly grandfather rather than the monster Hope knew him to be. "Children," he said warmly, "I want to share with you the story of my own son, Jonathan. He was a fine boy, strong and brave, who died fighting to protect civilization from savage raids. His sacrifice taught me that some people can be saved from their primitive nature while others..." He paused, meaningfully. "Others are too corrupted by their heritage to ever truly change." Hope's blood ran cold as she realized where this was leading. Blackstone wasn't trying to educate these children, he was sorting them. Some would be broken down and rebuilt as servants and workers. Others, those he deemed too savage to reform, would simply disappear. "Now," Blackstone continued, his pale eyes scanning the room with the calculating assessment of a predator choosing prey, "I want each of you to demonstrate your commitment to civilized behavior by telling us about the most savage thing your family ever did." Hope's mind raced as the other children began their recitations, each story more heartbreaking than the last. She thought of Little Bear, alone and terrified somewhere in this building, depending on her to find a way out. She thought of Samuel, probably locked in some territorial jail, blaming himself for their capture. Most of all, she thought of her parents' final words about staying strong and protecting each other. When Blackstone's attention finally turned to her, Hope made a decision that would change everything. Instead of the compliance he expected, she stood up straight, looked him directly in the eyes, and spoke with every ounce of dignity her mother had taught her. "The most savage thing my family ever did," she said clearly, "was trust that white men like you had any honor at all." The silence that followed was deafening. Blackstone's benevolent mask slipped completely, revealing the cold fury beneath. But Hope also saw something else in his expression, surprise, and perhaps even a flicker of grudging respect for her defiance. "I see," he said quietly. "Miss Hartwell, I think this one requires special attention. Transfer her to isolation wing tonight, and bring me the boy. I believe it's time for his first lesson in the consequences of family loyalty." Hope's heart stopped. She'd tried to protect Little Bear by drawing Blackstone's attention to herself, but instead she'd put him directly in harm's way. As the attendants moved to escort her from the room, she caught sight of his small face through a doorway, pale with terror but still watching her with absolute trust that somehow, some way, she would find a way to save them both. The isolation wing was exactly what it sounded like, a place where inconvenient children could be forgotten indefinitely. As the heavy door clanged shut behind her, Hope realized that her defiance might have sealed both their fates, but she also knew that she'd rather die fighting than live as Blackstone's broken puppet. Somewhere in the darkness beyond her cell, she could hear Little Bear crying. The sound gave her strength even as it broke her heart. As long as they were both alive, there was still hope. And as long as there was hope, she would never stop fighting to get them home. The truth came in whispers through the ventilation grates that connected the isolation wing to the rest of Blackstone's facility. Hope had been lying in her cell for 3 days, surviving on bread crusts and water, when she heard Little Bear's voice drifting through the metal ducts that carried sound from the lower levels. But he wasn't crying anymore. He was talking, speaking in rapid, urgent Cherokee to someone Hope couldn't see. His words painted pictures that made her blood run cold. Children who arrived healthy but grew thin and pale. Older students who were taken away for special training and never returned. And most horrifying of all, the basement rooms where Blackstone conducted his medical research on Cherokee bloodlines. "The man with dead eyes keeps asking about the pictures," Little Bear whispered in their native language. "He wants to know why I draw things before they happen." He brought other children who can do special things, a girl who knows what people are thinking, a boy who can make plants grow faster. "He's collecting us like butterflies pinned to boards." Hope pressed her ear closer to the grate, her heart racing. Little Bear's prophetic drawings weren't unique. Blackstone was systematically gathering Cherokee children with unusual abilities, convinced that he could somehow extract or harness their gifts for his own purposes. But it was Little Bear's next words that changed everything. "Thunder Horse is coming tonight. I drew it 3 times to be sure. He's bringing the fire spirits with him." Hope's breath caught. Samuel was alive and free. But how could Little Bear possibly know that? Unless his gift for seeing the future had grown stronger under stress, the way a broken bone sometimes healed stronger than before. She didn't have to wait long for confirmation. As darkness fell over the facility, Hope heard sounds that had become foreign to her ears during their imprisonment. Natural sounds of the Wyoming wilderness. An owl called from somewhere near the building, answered by another from the opposite direction. But Hope recognized those calls as Cherokee signals she'd learned as a child, patterns used by hunting parties to communicate without alerting their prey. Then came the smoke. At first it was just a whisper of scent drifting through the ventilation system. Wood smoke tinged with something else, something that made her eyes water slightly. But the smell grew stronger, and with it came sounds of confusion from other parts of the building. Doors opening, hurried footsteps, raised voices shouting orders. Hope pressed her face to the small barred window of her cell and saw the impossible. Orange light flickering against the facility's outer walls, shadows dancing in patterns that suggested multiple fires burning simultaneously around the building's perimeter. "Fire! Fire in the outer courtyard!" someone shouted from the corridor beyond her door. "All staff to emergency stations!" The facility erupted into chaos. Hope could hear attendants running through the halls, keys jingling, doors slamming. But beneath the human sounds, she caught something else. The whisper-soft footsteps of someone moving through the building with the stealth of a hunting cat. Her cell door opened without warning. Hope scrambled backward, expecting to see one of Blackstone's brutal attendants. Instead, a figure stepped into the narrow space, and Hope's heart nearly stopped with relief and joy. Samuel stood before her, no longer the neat rancher who'd bid on them at the auction. His clothes were darkened with soot and dirt, his face was painted with traditional Cherokee war markings, and his eyes held a dangerous intensity she'd never seen before. But when he looked at her, that fierce expression softened into something tender and protective. "Ayita," he said, using her Cherokee name like a prayer. "Are you hurt?" Hope threw herself into his arms, feeling his solid strength and warmth after days of cold stone and cruel isolation. "Little bear," she whispered urgently. "They have him in the lower levels. Blackstone is doing terrible things." "I know," Samuel said grimly. "I've been watching this place for 3 days, learning the layout, counting guards. Tonight seemed like the perfect time for a distraction." He gestured toward the window where the orange glow was growing brighter. "Controlled fires in the storage buildings, nothing that will spread to the main structure. But enough smoke and panic to keep everyone busy while I get you both out." They moved through corridors filled with chaos, Samuel leading with the confidence of someone who'd mapped every inch of the building. Other children peered out from behind partially open doors, their eyes wide with hope and terror. Hope wanted to free them all, but Samuel shook his head when she reached for door handles. "We can't save everyone tonight," he said quietly, "but once you're both safe, I'm coming back for the others. I promise you that." They found Little Bear in a basement room that made Hope's stomach turn. The walls were covered with his drawings, but these weren't the hopeful pictures he'd created at Thunder Creek Ranch. These were dark visions of pain and separation, children trapped behind bars, and faceless figures conducting unspeakable experiments. But in the center of one wall was a new drawing that made Hope gasp with recognition. It showed 3 figures, herself, Little Bear, and Samuel, standing together in sunshine while dark shapes burned in the background. At the bottom, in Little Bear's careful print, were the words, "Family wins." Little Bear sat in the corner of the room, arms wrapped around his knees, rocking slightly. When he saw Samuel and Hope, his face transformed with joy so pure it broke Hope's heart. "Thunder Horse," he whispered, scrambling to his feet. "I knew you would come. I drew it so many times." Samuel knelt down and gathered the small boy into his arms, his painted face fierce with protective love. "I will never let anyone separate us again, little warrior. That's a promise." But as they prepared to leave, Colonel Blackstone appeared in the doorway, flanked by 2 guards. His usually perfect appearance was disheveled, his hair mussed, and his eyes wild with rage and something that looked disturbingly like madness. "Did you really think," he said with deadly calm, "that a few barn fires would be enough to stop me? I've been planning this work for too long to let a savage ex-soldier ruin everything." Samuel stepped protectively in front of Hope and Little Bear, but Blackstone raised his hand to reveal a small Derringer pistol aimed directly at the children. "The boy comes with me," Blackstone said. "His abilities are too valuable to lose. The girl is expendable, and you're going to hang for arson and kidnapping." That's when Little Bear did something that none of them expected. He stepped around Samuel, looked directly at Colonel Blackstone, and spoke with the clear authority of someone channeling power far beyond his years. "Your son, Jonathan," Little Bear said quietly. "He didn't die fighting Cherokee raiders. He died trying to protect Cherokee children from soldiers who wanted to kill them. He died calling you a monster and begging God to forgive you." Blackstone's face went white as if he'd seen a ghost. The gun trembled in his hand as Little Bear continued, his young voice carrying impossible knowledge. "He visits me in dreams sometimes. He's still trying to protect Cherokee children even from the other side. He says to tell you that the only way to honor his memory is to let us go home." Dear friends, as we reach the climactic moment of Hope and Little Bear's journey, I'm reminded of the profound truth that family isn't always about blood. It's about who shows up when life gets hard. Like many of you who've raised children, lost spouses, or watched grandchildren grow, we know that real love means making impossible sacrifices and never giving up on the people who matter most. Samuel's desperate rescue mission mirrors every parent's deepest fear and greatest courage. What wouldn't we do to protect our children? In these uncertain times when families are scattered and traditional values seem under attack, Hope's story reminds us that authentic love and unwavering faith can overcome even the darkest forces. The Cherokee wisdom woven through this tale, that healing comes through connection, not isolation, speaks to every grandparent's heart who knows that our legacy lives through the values we pass down. Tell me in the comments, what moment in your life required the same fierce courage Samuel showed? And have you ever experienced a time when a stranger became family through acts of pure love? Share your stories below. Your experiences inspire and heal others who need to remember that hope is always possible. Colonel Blackstone staggered backward as if Little Bear's words had struck him with physical force. The derringer wavered in his trembling hand while his face cycled through emotions too complex and painful to name: rage, grief, denial, and underneath it all, the terrible recognition of truth. "That's impossible," Blackstone whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. "Jonathan died heroically, fighting savages who threatened innocent settlers. The official reports—" "Lies," Little Bear said simply, his 6-year-old voice carrying the weight of ancient wisdom. "You wrote those reports yourself to hide what really happened. But Jonathan sees everything now, and he's tired of watching you hurt children in his name." Samuel watched this exchange with growing amazement. The child he'd known as a frightened, mute victim of trauma had somehow transformed into a vessel for truths that needed to be spoken. Little Bear's gift wasn't just about drawing the future. It was about seeing through the lies that people told themselves to justify their cruelest actions. "He was 17 when he died," Little Bear continued, his dark eyes never leaving Blackstone's face. "Same age as Hope is now. He had brown hair like yours and blue eyes like his mother's. He wanted to be a doctor someday, to help people instead of hurting them." Blackstone's knees buckled, and he sank against the stone wall of the basement room. The gun slipped from his nerveless fingers to clatter on the floor as 20 years of carefully constructed mythology crumbled around him. "How could you possibly know?" he started, then stopped. The answer was obvious, even if he couldn't accept it. This Cherokee child possessed knowledge that transcended normal human understanding, knowledge that stripped away every comfortable lie Blackstone had built his crusade upon. "I know because he shows me," Little Bear said gently, his voice taking on the compassionate tone of someone speaking to a wounded animal. "He shows me the real last day, not the one you tell everyone." He was trying to stop Lieutenant Morrison from shooting Cherokee children who were hiding in a cave. He stood between the soldiers and the families, and when Morrison ordered him to move aside, Jonathan said no. He said his father taught him that real men protect the innocent, not murder them. Hope found herself holding her breath as the truth spilled out through Little Bear's revelations. This was why Blackstone had become obsessed with Cherokee children, not out of hatred for their race, but from a twisted need to justify his son's death by proving that the people Jonathan had died protecting were somehow worthy of salvation through suffering. "Morrison shot him in the back when he wouldn't move," Little Bear whispered, and now his voice carried the grief of a child forced to witness terrible things. Jonathan's last words weren't about victory or glory. He said, "Tell Papa that I kept faith with what he taught me about honor." But Morrison put in the reports that he died fighting Indians, and you believed it because believing it hurt less than knowing he died fighting for them. Samuel had moved closer during this revelation, ready to shield the children if Blackstone's breakdown turned violent. But instead of rage, the colonel simply crumpled, 20 years of misdirected grief finally finding its true target. "I built all of this," Blackstone said, his voice breaking as he gestured weakly toward the walls of his facility, "to honor a lie. I've tortured innocent children, destroyed families, convinced myself it was righteous work. all to avoid admitting that my son died with more courage and honor than I've ever possessed. Hope felt an unexpected wave of pity for this broken man. She understood the weight of survivor's guilt, the desperate need to make meaning from senseless loss. But understanding didn't equal forgiveness, not for the children who disappeared into his educational system, not for the families he'd torn apart, not for the 3 days of terror he'd put her and Little Bear through. "Jonathan forgives you," Little Bear said softly, "but he wants you to stop hurting people in his name. He wants you to help us fix what you broke." Samuel stepped forward carefully, his movements slow and non-threatening. "Colonel, there are children in this facility who need medical attention, who need to be returned to their families. You have the power to make that right." Blackstone looked up at Samuel with eyes that had aged decades in the space of minutes. "You were there too, weren't you? At the massacre. You saw what really happened." "I was a field medic," Samuel confirmed. "I tried to save Jonathan after he was shot. He was conscious long enough to give me a message for you, one I never had the chance to deliver." Hope watched as Blackstone's face crumpled with desperate hope. "What did he say?" Samuel's voice was gentle but clear. "He said, 'Tell Papa that love is stronger than fear, and that I learned that from him. Tell him to be the man he taught me to be, not the man his grief is making him become.'" The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sounds of chaos from the upper levels, where Blackstone's staff were still dealing with Samuel's diversionary fires. But in this basement room, a different kind of fire was burning. The painful but necessary flame of truth finally illuminating decades of darkness. "The other children," Blackstone said finally, his voice hollow but determined. "There are 43 of them currently in the facility. Some have been here for years. I've done terrible things in the name of education." "Then help us undo them," Hope said, speaking for the first time since Little Bear's revelations began. "Help us get them home." Blackstone nodded slowly, then pulled himself to his feet with visible effort. "The files are in my office. Every child's origin, their family's location, if known, their condition." He paused, seemingly unable to articulate the full extent of his crimes. "Some may never fully recover from what I've done to them." "Recovery takes time," Samuel said, "but it starts with truth and safety. Can you get us to the other children without alerting your guards?" "My guards work for money, not loyalty," Blackstone replied with bitter irony. "And the fires you set have most of them busy outside the building. We can reach the dormitories through the service corridors." As they prepared to leave the basement room, Little Bear turned back to look at the wall covered with his prophetic drawings. "I won't need these anymore," he said simply. "I've seen enough dark futures. From now on, I only want to draw happy endings." Hope took his small hand in hers, marveling at the strength and wisdom this terrible experience had awakened in her little brother. "Then that's what we'll give you," she promised. "Happy endings for everyone." Samuel led them toward the door, but paused to address Blackstone one final time. "This doesn't make us even, you understand? What you've done to these children can't be erased by one moment of conscience. But it's a start toward making amends." Blackstone nodded, accepting the judgment he knew he deserved. "I know. I'll spend whatever years I have left trying to repair the damage I've caused. It won't be enough, but it's all I can offer." As they climbed the stairs toward the main level of the facility, Hope felt something shift in her chest. Not the physical pain of her illness, but the emotional weight of hatred she'd been carrying. She was still angry, still hurt, still scarred by what Blackstone had put them through. But Little Bear's compassionate wisdom had shown her something important. Healing required moving beyond the need for revenge toward the harder work of rebuilding what had been broken. They had rescued each other in ways that went far deeper than a simple jailbreak. Now came the greater challenge of rescuing 43 other children and somehow building a future where such horrors could never happen again.